Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnTrack podcast. Today is a special edition where we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the electronics industry. As you can see, we're not in the studio or at Altium today. Like most of you, I'm working from home and we don't have access to all that great technology, which normally gives you great sound and video quality, but today, hey, you're going to be hanging out at my house. You're going to be hanging out at Mike's house today. So before Mike and I get started, just wanted to give you some background that for those of you that don't know Mike, he is the chief editor of Printed Circuit Design and Fab magazine, and also the chief editor of Circuit Assemblies magazine. UP Media is also the company that puts on PCB West in Santa Clara every year for decades now. And little fun fact, Mike actually studied some epidemiology in college, so he has a really interesting perspective to share about the impact of this worldwide crisis on you as a designer, and also very broadly the impact it's going to have on our industry. So a quick message before Mike and I get started. I wanted to read you a little something from Altium for those of you out there that are Altium users. Altium has put out a document, and if you're an Altium user, you'll be getting an email about our stand. But Altium has chosen to voluntarily close all of our offices, but we are working, we're wired for sound, so we'll all be working from home and doing that quite successfully. And we're glad to say that our 3 offices in China are coming back online. From Altium, this says, at Altium, the health and well-being of our users, associates, and communities are on our top priority. We understand the concerns and uncertainty you may be experiencing surrounding the coronavirus. And our team remains committed to being responsive to the needs of our community as the situation evolves. In light of these developments, we will continue to provide the highest quality of support to our users and don't anticipate any disruption or delay to service. I think through an email for our users, they'll be reaching out to you, and if you need on-demand licenses because they were on premise at your service and now you've been kicked out of the office, I think they're going to do things that are going to help you get on demand or whatever you need. So that should be coming out in the next day or two. Okay, that's all the boring announcements I had to make. So now I just want to welcome my friend and industry veteran, Mike Buetow. Mike, welcome, and thank you for letting me prattle on there for a moment.
It's my pleasure, Judy. Thank you for having me on.
So we had an interesting pre-call tomorrow, and I feel like I just want to hit play. But why don't we start out, Mike, where you just sort of give us an electronics industry state of the union. Like, you have a broad worldwide view of what's going on, and I really appreciate you reporting on this. So lay it on us. What's going on?
Sure. So if I try to boil this down into 2 groups, right? Winners and losers, at least in the near term. I think I would look at the winners as being companies that are making tablets. So the tablet OEMs, we're seeing demand is picking up in China in particular, as companies that are affected by the coronavirus wanted workers to start telecommuting. And so as they pushed the remote work, people went out and bought tablets. I suspect that that's going to ripple through in some of the other regions as well. I think that some of the component manufacturers might benefit from this because component shortages could lead to higher prices, and yet it's not at all clear that the demand side will be able to sustain the higher pricing. So there's 2 groups that might benefit. The losers are pretty much everybody else. Unfortunately, I'm not trying to make light of it, but we've seen just in the last couple of weeks, the IT spending forecast has been knocked down this year from 3 to 4% to growth to 1%. That's just on the basis of 4 weeks. Okay, so 4 weeks offline takes 3 points out of the growth of a multi-billion-dollar industry. Global notebook unit shipments are expected to fall 35-ish% sequentially. We were originally looking at about a 15 to 17% drop off. So we're looking at maybe a 20-point change, just again, on the basis of 3 to 4 weeks downtime in China.
Ouch.
Smartphone shipments were originally forecast to grow. They're going to be up over 1.3 billion units. Now they're expected to drop over 3% this year. It'll slow down all the 5G implementation for sure. Automotive electronics will definitely decline because no one's buying cars right now. If you look at my Twitter feed, I went to Target yesterday here in the Boston suburbs, and took a couple photos of the paper goods aisles, and those are empty. And then, I took a picture of the electronics department, and the TVs are all there, all lined up, this gorgeous display, there's dozens of TVs, everything is on sale. You can buy a 70-inch Samsung for, it's a 4K ultra high def TV for under $500. I mean, it's just unreal. So there's going to be a lot of craziness. PC devices are going to decline at least 10% this year, according to the latest reports. Most of these have just come out in the last week, so everything is really fresh. We're still trying to work through it all. It could get worse. I hear from IPC that electronics manufacturers that they've surveyed are looking at up to a 5-week shipment delay from suppliers due to COVID-19. Although that contrasts in part with some of the things that I'm hearing. I can get into that a little bit more, as we talk. Okay.
Wow. It's amazing that just 4 weeks could do that, right? And I think about the airlines too, and just it's amazing, right? The impact in such a short period of time. You mentioned iPads. Are you seeing anything? I heard someone say on the news the other day that they're also looking, school districts are looking to work with Apple to get special pricing on iPads because so many students, right, are doing online school. Have you seen anything like that?
So my kids are at home, just like many other school districts, in counties and states across the country. There hasn't been any dialogue that I've specifically heard on that, and part of that is, I think, just logistics. Most schools are near the end of their budget years, and so they don't have the funds. Also, there's a matter of just, okay, we have to get the documents and then get them in the hands of students. And on top of all that, we have to make sure that we have the software and the lesson plans created for online learning. So what I've been seeing is more of a one-on-one type of response, which is, here, we're going to email you the work that you need to do, go to Khan Academy, watch this video, that kind of thing. It's ad hoc. It's not systematic. And it doesn't look to me right now like there's any major equipment buys in the forecast as a result of this.
That makes perfect sense. What do you think when you see the numbers dropping for things like iPhones and for iPhones, personal computers, all the things you mentioned? What's the ripple effect really on the supply chain? Because they're not using up all of that. Like, how does that all work?
Right. So it's a bit unclear. And I think it's going to depend on how long people are out, right? So we are a week or so behind Italy, which seems to be the place that's been worst hit in Europe. We're probably a few days behind the UK overall. Massachusetts seems like it's a few days behind New York in terms of this. West Virginia's behind everybody. So it's going to come down in part to, I think, just how dramatic the impact is on workers. What's going to happen to their personal spending makes up about 70% of the worldwide economy. So as individuals see they go out on furlough, or they lose their jobs, if they are using up all their vacation time and won't be able to go on vacations later in the year as a result of this, without some government stimulus, and I know some of that's in the work. I mean, there's a lot of vectors here, and
Yeah.
it's easy to say, well, hey, look, no one's spending now, but when they go back out into the real world, there's going to be all this pent up enthusiasm and all these dollars that need to be spent. It's not at all clear to me that that's what's going to happen. I think that there will be a little bit, and it'll depend in part on how long this lasts, right? If people are isolated for a longer time, then I think it's less likely that they're going to go out and immediately start spending. I think if it's a couple of weeks, then much of that that revenue will find its way back into the general economy.
Yeah. It's interesting. You were talking about your Twitter account. By the way, Mike, because I think you put out such good tweets and stuff, why don't you share your Twitter feed so our listeners can follow you on Twitter?
Sure. It's at Mike Buetow. So MikeBuetow.
Thank you. So I took a couple photos of I live in an apartment complex in San Diego. I'm sort of new to San Diego. I moved down here three years ago, so I'm just renting an apartment right now. And I went down to throw some trash out yesterday, and normally we have two trash bins. One is the garbage and one is recycled. And normally as trash day gets closed, the garbage one, right, because people throwing the garbage out, gets quite full, and the recycle one, just like some empty boxes, all that. Well, because of this dynamic you're talking about, we went in and the garbage thing was almost empty and the recycle was overflowing with TV boxes, Amazon boxes, online everything, right? Because people, I think, are sort of self-quarantining and or ordering so much online. And to your point, I did see some TV boxes in there, and I was like, man, who knew? Okay, you are very much in touch with the trade associations like IPC, SMTA, IEEE. Are they putting out any recommendations sort of to industry professionals?
Right. So everyone seems to be taking a little bit different tact. Some of the trade groups that have events coming up are pulling back on those, asking for folks to just hit the pause button and to wait to see what happens. That makes sense. Some shows have been canceled, and they're trying to repopulate them online. Again, this will be really interesting how this all plays out over time. IPC has been doing some regular surveying of its members, and it's much appreciated because they cast a really wide net. Every couple of weeks, they're updating their surveys, and what they are finding right now is they expect sales to decrease in the first and second quarters of 2020, and for the calendar 2020 as a whole. That's the latest survey they did was March 3rd to 5th, so just a week or so ago. They found that more than half of their respondents expect sales to fall in the first quarter. 63% expect them to be down in the second quarter, and 62% expect them to be down for calendar 2020. I mean, often in our industry, we see Q1 as sort of the sales relax after the Christmas holidays. Mm-hmm. So taking a little bit of a breather there isn't the biggest deal. Q2 is when things start to ramp up. And so as this is hitting at the same time that we're expecting that ramp, it does create some problems. Most of the OEMs that I've spoken with and a lot of the fabricators and assemblers said that their backlogs were as busy or as full as they've ever had them. So this is coming maybe at an opportune time in some respects because they can afford a little bit of the hit. Again, it sort of just depends on how long that they're sidelined for.
Right.
There is widespread cutbacks in business travel, and I don't think that comes as any surprise. Yeah. And so that's what I'm hearing out of IPC. TPCA, which is really closer to the center of where all this started. So that's the Taiwan Printed Circuit Association, is actually more optimistic right now because in their eyes, the worst is over. Again, they're Southeast Asia centric. So most of China has come back online. And by online, I'm talking close to 80% or more of capacity is back up and running. Even in Hubei, where which was sort of the ground zero for the COVID-19, it looks like most of the factories are back up and running. And the biggest issue right now is just getting all the workers back. It's not lingering fears over widespread, disease. It's still there, don't get me wrong. But the interesting thing in all this is that the component supply chain, right? What happens is that since much of those materials come from China, and China traditionally has a 2-week period where it's offline because of the Chinese New Year,
Right.
manufacturers in the West stock up prior to that. They know this going in. And so the impact really was more of a blip to date in terms of the supply chain than a dramatic, we're not going to be able to ship type of event.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Now, let me take first of all, again, let's talk about, some impacts to us as Altium as a company. Is we have a widespread spread travel ban to and from other countries and even domestically right now. And as you said, and I said earlier, our Chinese offices we have 3 offices there. They're coming back online, which we're delighted to hear. And then I reached out, and we'll dig into this deeper a little bit, but as I reached out to some of the designers and people I know in the industry to ask them about the impact it was having on them, particularly a few people have large design teams that are, also in the US, but also in places like Bangalore, India, or China. So I have some good input on that, but same measures are being put in place. Like you said, I don't think anyone's surprised. And so you kind of covered, so you think as far as manufacturers that they're sort of recovering rather quickly in China since there's such a strong manufacturing base. What about, is there any other data you have, sort of the impact that it might have to OEMs, or say people that are designers that are working for an OEM, anywhere in the world? Are you seeing anything besides what you've mentioned already?
Right. So it's very mixed so far. And so in talking with OEMs, I've called around, especially the last several days. I've been calling in all my contacts, what's going on at your company. So it's a bit anecdotal, but it seems like the big defense primes are telling all non-essential personnel to stay home, and they haven't completely banned all corporate travel, but the permissions now go very high up. We're talking VP level, and this is at, I don't want to name any,
Right.
some of the largest defense primes in the country.
Right.
And if you do go on travel, then you have to be self-quarantined for 2 weeks after you return.
Right.
So they're taking very few chances. On the other hand, I've talked to some designers who have heard from their CEO, look, stay home. You don't need to come in. And then they hear from their business director, no, we need you. You're essential. You have to come in. So designers who, generally speaking, could work remotely, are well suited to this type of task, are getting mixed messages. Then I go down the list to some of the fabricators, and it's very interesting because I've talked to one publicly traded fabricator who told me that the CEO of that company now has to approve all corporate travel.
Yeah.
So think about that for a moment. Some shops, depending on how big they are, their issues are, in fact, in general, the issues are really availability of labor, access to parts, and government regulations. Okay. So by availability of labor, that gets into the question of, if I have kids, do I have to stay home with them, or can I go to work? And if I go to work, is there a possibility that I'm going to get infected and then bring that home to them? For other folks, I've talked to companies who say, well, we don't really employ lots of people who have kids who are in schools, but they're older generation workers and they get a little spooked if they might bring something home to a partner, or they might catch something themselves. And if some of those people start calling in sick or just calling in absent, the operations of some of those smaller fabs, will quickly be affected. So the small guys really are at risk. I've heard a lot of changes to vacation policies and things like that. Some companies are telling folks you can, use up all your vacation now, and then you can borrow into next year, so that you don't have to worry about, finances for the near term. That may mean people aren't taking vacations, in the next 12 months because they use up all their vacation time for sick time, and that's something that's going to have to be worked out. But the message that's being sent is, stay home. If you feel symptoms, stay home. We'll make sure that the check keeps coming. And I think that that's the right message to send. There are a couple of large EMS companies that have already reduced their revenue expectations for the coming quarters, and most of the publicly traded EMS companies, I think, have said, "Hey, look, we're pulling all of our guidance. We just don't know what's going to happen, and it would be irresponsible for us to project right now. There's just too many unknowns."
It makes sense. But in the case of EMS companies or fabricators, these are not people that can work remote. You have to be there to run, right? Lamination
Right.
presses and pick and place machines and all those things. So it's those folks, I think, really have are going to have a tough time as if they continue to tighten up. I think the CDC had come out with recommendations, not force, but recommendations now for gatherings of 10 or less. Well, if you're a big EMS, to keep your doors open, you're going to have to bust that one. So
great point. So here's some of the things that I'm hearing. Some companies are going to second and even third shifts in order to spread out their workforce.
Interesting.
I've heard companies, they're shutting down their cafeterias, or they're even turning off the free coffee. They're taking away things like cups and objects like that would be easily contaminated and spread around. They are increasing their hygiene controls and their cleaning policy. I've heard of the non-essential employees, meaning finance, quoting, sales, all that back office stuff is all home. But you're right, the manufacturing people do have to show up. The customers are no longer allowed to visit in some cases. In other cases, they are allowed to visit, but they don't want to. Suppliers are almost always banned at this point from visiting, except for if somebody needs to calibrate a machine, for example. So it's really gone. You could say it's gone extreme, but on the other hand, it seems like most people really don't want to go out and see other people if they don't have to. So it's kind of just sort of self-enforced. There was there was one company that pointed out that Mexico is in a very different position right now because the number of reported affected people is very low, and so
Interesting.
And so there's this sense that they are kind of having a party right now. I don't know that for sure. I haven't been on the ground there. Perhaps because you're in San Diego, maybe you're getting a little bit more messaging than I am. But I think that it makes it difficult for a lot of North American manufacturers who also have operations in Mexico to implement rules across all of North America because people in Mexico are looking around saying, "Hey, look, no one is sick here, so we're just not going to follow any restrictions."
That's interesting. Now you make me wish I would have reached out to. There's a couple specific ones that are coming to mind. Now I want to reach out and ask them that kind of impact. That's a really interesting point. Well, let me see if I can pull up some comments that I got here. This one is a large multinational. So he says that there's many developments there. He has team, a large team here in the U.S., also in China. They said that he's noticing the biggest impact has been on the supply chain, first and second tier. Raw resources seem to be having a domino effect. Obviously, they don't want to put a bunch of very expensive stock, right, on their shelves, but now they're starting to see the danger of how an event like this can cripple a company when the pipeline gets empty or cut off, right? So they're sort of reevaluating, how to look at that just-in-time model. And that one makes sort of IoT, I won't get into details or I'd give it away, but a big IoT provider. And the next person works for a startup in the Bay Area. When you think about this at a startup, right, y'all wear 12 hats and you need your lab benches and you need everything because it's all hands-on. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we deal without our oscilloscopes, our lab benches, our testing equipment, all of that. They said their fabricators and assembly facilities are still running behind due to the decreased availability workforce in Asia, but that it's coming back online. I thought this was an interesting thing. I don't know if you're seeing this, Mike, where he's saying hiring's a challenge because people need to meet in person, right, to interview. Right? Nobody wants to come in and do an interview right now. And again, a startup, they're ramping. They need bodies, and they're seeing an impact on hiring.
Yes, the issue is worldwide, right? So China, which was already always struggles a little bit coming out of Chinese New Year to get workers to return. They've changed their policies, or the corporate policies, years ago to stop giving bonuses prior to the holiday in order to convince workers to come back in order to get their bonus. But with the virus and the shutdowns that just prolonged the Chinese New Year furlough, bringing people back has been an issue. That said, you talk to the SMTCs. Well, actually, they're not a good example because they've moved everything out of China. But you talk to Jables and Flexes and companies like that, and they'd gotten down to about 10% capacity in China, which is their biggest manufacturing footprint. They all are back up in the 80% range at most, if not all, of their facilities. So, things are returning to normal there. And since that's where the bulk of the volume is, it says to me that parts should be able to make their way around the world, provided that the rest of the supply chain is intact, meaning the buyers are there, and can order, that the demand is there because the customers want it. Those are still the big ifs.
Yeah. It's very interesting and really changing day to day, which is something
Absolutely.
to behold. I mean, I know in my lifetime there's never been an event like this. This email is very interesting too. This is from probably one of the largest fabricators, and I believe they have EMS capabilities too, but I know they have heavy duty because I've actually been through their factory. I don't know how they're doing. They said all employees are sent to home offices now, but of course they have people in the factory. They said, thankfully, the internet has been stable enough to handle all of that. And their telephone system and their video chats are working just fine. They said the manufacturing side is running as usual. So sort of like what you said, Mike, the people who can go home went home, but the critical manufacturing staff is still there, but they're all wearing masks and gloves.
Wow. Well, and consider this, many companies that are supplying the Pentagon are set up with secure networks. But then as you move farther down the supply chain, they may not be as sophisticated. And the ability to get those types of networks up and running quickly, to test them out, to make sure everybody has the right software. Again, it's not a simple thing.
Well, and the military, as you know, the supply chain, all that is not agile. Things they build now, they designed 10 years ago. It's taken them forever to get to this point where, if they're putting something on a satellite or, on a F-35, it's had years and years and years of testing and all that, right? And so to change anything, software security, any of that, they don't move fast. It's not their strong suit.
Consider that the aerospace, another very long lead time, end market. When you have American and United and Delta all cutting flights left and right, it suggests that if capacity doesn't rise in the near term or even the midterm, the orders for planes may be cut back, and of course that has a big ripple effect, in particular in North America, where we're heavily reliant on the aerospace and defense industries.
Yeah, for sure. This gentleman from this large European manufacturer said ordering components is not a problem at the moment. The logistics have been working well.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, he said, WebEx is working fine, and they're having to do training through WebEx for new employees. This particular person is a PCB designer inside of this large manufacturer, and for him, it's fine to work. It's fine to work off site. It's not had that much impact on it. Okay, here's another person who said it's just super stressful. This person, if I said the brand, it's a huge brand, and he said it's been super stressful time, but they're getting through it. He said the biggest thing is planning. It's just not knowing, right? Not being able to do forecasting and all of that. Again, this person can do design work from home, and he can also manage a design team. And the last one I'll share is from a pretty substantially sized service bureau. And, most of those people work off-site anyways, right? And he said a straight up 2/3 of them already work from home. He's saying so for them, it's had, impact for sure, but not one that would cripple them. So, okay, this one just came in. This is also from a large OEM. The points he gave me are they're keeping facilities open. Again, it's a large manufacturing site. It's an OEM that has their own manufacturing facility. Still a lot of folks, non-essential, are going off site. They're doing voluntary quarantines for anyone or their families that are, pretty standard stuff. But this one came this morning. It says from their IT department, it says, we're starting to see stress on our firewall. Please restrict your internet connections to mission essential. We've had many folks working remotely, so we need to conserve our resources. So, have you heard that too, Mike? I heard that on the news last night, that there have been a lot of hits on the CDC that look sort of sinister, right? That they're concerned that, maybe some of our enemies want to try to do harm while we're, and I'm sure it's not just the U.S., that the hackers are busy right now. Have you heard anything like that?
I haven't, but hackers hack. That's their job, right?
Totally. Okay, so what I thought would be fun to wrap up here is, two things. One, I thought it was an interesting little piece. Tell us about your studies in epidemiology. That was kind of a fun fact you shared yesterday.
Yeah, so at the risk of further embarrassing myself, I started off in college in epidemiology, which is applied math. It's statistics, basically. And, if at this point, anybody who's a great epidemiologist goes on to get their PhD, right? If I were working on my PhD in epidemiology, I would still be in school right now. So that was going to end up being a very long process. So I switched.
Yeah.
To maybe to the chagrin of my doctor parents, but not to mine. But you do learn a few things along the way. And, in epidemiology, there's something called quarantine ring theory, okay,
Mm-hmm.
which is, basically that you're trying to keep the people who are, exposed or, affected by a particular infectious disease from those who might be susceptible to it, or not otherwise inoculated. And right now, since there's no, antidote, there's no vaccination, anything like that, you're just trying to create these pockets or cells of individuals and keep them apart from other people. And, that's what we're seeing right now, right? So China did that on a very, very broad scale, unprecedented in human history. To basically encircle a city of 15 million people, almost like the same size of metropolitan New York, and say, guess what? No one gets in, no one gets out, and putting up security cameras all over the place. You can't even leave your apartment. Unprecedented. The fact is that China seems to
And
have
propped
tipped.
up hospitals like overnight, right? Like,
Yeah.
it was wild how fast they got facilities up.
So right, and that's a very important point, is that China was able to respond quickly. The nature of its government is such that it allows it to go in and make new rules on the fly and execute those rules in real time. The U.S. is very different, and I'm not going to get into the different ideologies and things like that. That's not my point here. But they were able, if the data are to be believed, to tip that curve. And the U.S. is going to be in a position for some time to see, the more draconian measures that we take right now, I think the more likely we put an end to this in the shortest amount of time. Whether our culture will allow that is a whole nother thing. But what I find interesting is that we were talking about some of the links in the supply chain, and we've talked about the fabricators, the designers, the assemblers, the OEMs. But what's been missing in that conversation to this point has been the component vendors themselves. And those are the ones who, through the 30 years I've been in the industry, have bore the brunt of developing the software and traceability and tracking tools that would allow them to really control inventories correctly, to understand where the demand was coming from, whether that demand was real or whether it was double and triple ordering, which often happens in times of crisis, and to properly allocate, and I know nobody likes that word, but to properly allocate, their resources and their parts in a efficient and profitable manner. So, not to diminish the very real and devastating impacts of COVID-19, but this is something that I explore in my latest editorial, and that'll go up on circuitsassembly.com and PCD&F.com here in the next 24 hours. I find this fascinating a time as I can remember in the electronic supply chain. And that's because all of these stress tests that we've put into place, all of these systems that we've put into place we're going to find out whether they work. And we are going to learn, whether our ability to look up and down the supply chain, is at the level, the accuracy that we need, or whether we need corrections. We are going to find out just how good we are in finance. I mean, I think that we have the best finance managers in the world in the EMS industry, because how else can they get by on these, 2%, 3% margins, right?
I know,
Where they're carrying
right?
they buy all the parts in advance. They're carrying all the inventory on their balance sheet. They may not get paid for 75 days after
Crazy. I know.
the shipment, so they're really good at managing cash. The question that keeps coming up is, will this change China, right? Will China cease to be world's workshop? And some have argued that, yeah, this will be the tipping point. People will move elsewhere. I'm not sure that I disagree. I think it's the right question. But then you have to ask the follow-up, which is if it does lessen the world's dependence on China, where will all that migrate? in some respects, having this distributed supply chain has worked out really well because it's only taken off things offline piecemeal, right? The whole world
Right.
hasn't shut down.
Right.
And that's not a small thing.
No, it's
Um,
not.
I think that inventory decisions are kind of cyclical. You mentioned just-in-time manufacturing earlier and lean manufacturing, and of course, those are big philosophies in our industry and are well implemented. Um, Historically, I think when the industry has been faced with supply issues, it has responded by raising stocks, and we've gotten much better at that, right?
Yeah.
So if we look back a couple years ago, where we stared down an undercapacity situation, particularly with MLCCs and some types of resistors and crystal oscillators and things like
Yeah.
that, we overcame that. We didn't lose our minds. We didn't, double and triple order. We didn't bring all sorts of excess capacity online, which right now would feel like, we bear that weight of all that spending.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that we will learn some things from this shutdown, but I think for a change, we're actually well positioned to weather this storm. And my gut tells me that supply chains are unlikely to up and move just due to COVID-19. It's not like an earthquake that like they saw in Thailand or in Japan. When it
Yeah.
comes to pandemics, there's nowhere to hide. So I think that everyone's going to take a step back. They're going to review their chains, and ultimately they're going to stay put.
Well, I really liked when we were doing the prep call, you said something I thought was, you know, on the border of being profound, which is you can't close your borders, right, to a disease.
Oh, yeah.
I like
Yeah. Well,
that, right? That's a
yeah.
quotable quote, and that is this is affecting all of us. Um, well, we're about out of time, and I think this has been a really interesting and very relevant conversation. So thanks so much for coming to hang out in my apartment with me. I, s-
Anytime.
I see Larry Bird in your place, so hey, this is
There.
here we are, armchair podcast. But what are some just a couple thoughts from your end? Like I'm seeing people actually be more engaged, right, with each other, even if we're from our own homes. I see, which is what we do as people when there's a disaster, right? We tend to come around and help each other and stick together. That's one thing I'm observing. What are like some upsides? I think you just mentioned the supply chain. It's well distributed. And I agree with you there. Is there any other upsides that you're sort of seeing just as we wrap up here?
So that's a hugely salient point, in my opinion. If you look at again the quick pundits think that this will spur a big trend toward telecommuting, that it will become a permanent fixture
Mm,
as part of our world. I disagree. I think that this will reinforce humans' need for person-to-person contact, in-person contact, and that you get isolated for a week or 2 weeks and you get cooped up, especially the younger you are, you will not want to sit behind a screen all day in your bedroom or in a your personal study or something like that. You're going to want to be back out among people. So I think this will actually have an odd reinforcing effect that companies will have people that want to be in the factory. They will want to be around other workers.
that's interesting. Uh, I can tell you from personal experience, I worked from home for a couple different, over the course of my career, I've probably worked at home 5 to 7, 8 years from home. And I can tell you that when I took this position, because sometimes I was, say, a sales and marketing person for a person on the East Coast. So I didn't have to move. That was great. I didn't want to leave Southern California for Baltimore, Maryland, right? So, but I can tell you now that the last 3 years I've been in a beautiful office in San Diego, I never want to leave an office again. It to your point, I feel like it cured me. I kind of like this week being in my fluffy chair and all that, but I wouldn't want it to be permanent. I think humans are made for connections, and hopefully we'll get trade shows back on the map. We have decided, Altium has decided to cancel our Altium Live in Europe because it's in Barcelona, Spain, and they're just starting to see it. So by October, but fingers crossed, Mike. Hopefully we'll be together again at PCB West, and then right after that, Altium Live in San Diego. I think people need to be around each other.
Yeah, to your point, I do think that it's very difficult to have that same level of not just interpersonal communication, but dialogue when you're online. Okay, so there's limitations to the technology and the attention span and things like that. Whereas when somebody's in front of you, you know that they're talking to you. You can pick up on their body language and things like that. And the analogy I make is like those, in an office, there's always those men's room type caucuses, right? Where information gets exchanged,
Yep.
things that you might not have known about. And it's really hard to formalize that level of communication. Same thing happens at trade shows. You might walk by somebody, you see their badge, you're like, oh, you're Rick Hartley. Oh, you're so-and-so. It starts this conversation. It develops a relationship. You learn from that. I mean, I think that's why Altium Live is an important event. PCB West, which we sponsor, we're still planning on having it in September. It's important for that because I think that there is a nature of information exchange in person that simply we have not yet been able to effectively replicate online.
No, I totally agree with you. High five to that. Well, hopefully we'll be together again, Mike, sooner than later. And again, thanks so much for coming on today. This has been an interesting conversation, and let's keep in touch. Oh, also for our listeners, I did an interview with Mike that's going to be in the April newsletter. We're doing some migration of a website. I don't know if I have a subscribe page for you, but hopefully if you're an Altium user, you should be getting that newsletter, and there's a great interview for Mike, sort of packaging these all in facts and figures, and hopefully it's not obsolete by the time we get it to you, but we'll try to keep it tuned as we get closer. So thank you, Mike. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for keeping an eye out in the industry for us.
My pleasure, Judy. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. All right. To our listeners and viewers, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope this has been really useful. I hope it will help you prepare in this new world, and everyone from Altium wishes you health and well-being, and please take care of yourself, and we'll see you next week, probably still from my living room here on the OnTrack podcast. See you next time. Until then, remember to always stay on track.